Tonight on Free Minds TV, President Obama finally breaks his promise to shut down Guantanamo Bay after 2 years in office. We'll also be discussing why the Japanese-American community is a little bit concerned about hearings that are going to be held about the Muslim-American community, plus calls for secession in the state of Texas. All that coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome to episode 195 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. It's still Toby here with you.
And Nick.
We've got a lot to get into, Nick. We're going to be getting into a story that I found the headline at least particularly interesting, talking about the Japanese community being concerned about some hearings being held on the Muslim community. Maybe dating back to some World War II era stuff, I'm guessing there, possibly. I haven't read the story, but I'm guessing.
Does everybody in the U.S. even know about that? It's usually talked about very briefly in school, but I think a lot of us don't really actively
very embarrassing
remember that it
still,
happened.
Nick. We can't talk about it yet. It's still, give it another 100 years, and then we'll talk about how the U.S.
When no one who lived through it
interned
is
the
alive
Japanese
anymore.
Anyways, we're also going to be getting into that secession story from Texas. But first, I want to get into it. It's been all over the news, Nick, so by the time we're talking about it, hopefully most people have heard about this. Let's stir it back up. Talk about Obama finally giving up on that campaign promise. I heard him talk about it all the time on the campaign trail. Really got a lot of people rallying behind him, thinking that it was this president for sweeping change. Finally giving up on that campaign promise to close down Guantanamo Bay.
Well, a lot of people did think that civil liberties protections were going to get better again under the Obama administration.
And we said it wasn't.
We said it wasn't, and it would only get worse.
And it's finally...
And we were right.
I feel vindicated in a sense. I'm very disappointed, but I do feel
I'm usually not happy when I'm
in a way, because we did call it when he was running for president. We said, it's not going to do any of this. It's campaign promises that he's not going to be fulfilling. And...
Well, you mean politicians say things that they're not actually going to
get
do?
Elected? Hopefully some of the supporters out there will see this and realize that, well, when you're voting for one of the two parties, you're not really going to get change. You're going to get exactly the same thing. Exactly. President Obama signed an executive order on Monday that will create a formal system of infinite detention for those held at the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, who continue to pose a significant threat to national security, which will not be determined by a court of law, but rather, some kind of a secret military tribunal of sorts. The announcement coming more than 2 years after Obama vowed in another executive order to close the detention centers, all but cements Guantanamo Bay's continuing role in U.S. counterterrorism policy. So I guess it's going to be there for a while longer. The administration's original plans to create a detention center in the United States and prosecute some detainees in federal court have all but collapsed in the face of bipartisan congressional opposition. So he just couldn't get the House and the Senate to agree and have actual trials for people who are accused of crimes. Instead, they can just rot in some kind of a horrible prison cell in Cuba. Interesting. Nice. I hope people are very happy. The executive order recognizes the reality that some Guantanamo Bay detainees will remain in U.S. custody for many years, if not for life, without a trial. Obama says, quote, "I strongly believe that the American system of justice is a key part of our arsenal in the war against al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Except for the fact that we're not going to be using the American system of justice here because, well, he failed to do that. Instead, he's going to continue the same old. But if you'll note in his speech, he still says that he likes the idea of American system of justice and will use it to fight al-Qaeda, just not with the Guantanamo Bay detainees." He didn't say that.
Well, he must like the American system of justice, Toby, because he is a constitutional scholar, after all.
Right, but he's not going to be using it he's not going to be fulfilling his campaign promises and actually trying these...
or following the Constitution.
Right, he's not actually going to be following through with that and actually giving these people a trial. Some of them probably very bad people.
Many of them probably guilty, yes.
Yep. But still, if you're going to be
not all of them are guilty, though. I mean, a lot of detainees were released after it was discovered, yeah, we really don't have any good evidence you're a terrorist.
Well, the other problem
It's not like everybody in Guantanamo Bay was actually a terrorist. The government's own position says, yeah, we did get quite a few of those cases wrong.
Yeah, and when they do have these tribunal trials, a lot of the information that's used against them, some of the evidence that's used against them, comes from coercion and torture techniques. So they torture someone and they accuse you of being a terrorist, and that's used against you in the tribunal trial. They also will use techniques such as presenting evidence against you, but you can't review the evidence because, well, it's classified information. So none of that stuff is going to change, unfortunately. Obama says it's going to get a little better, but of course his new special tribunal is very much of the same old Bush-era policy. So really, did we get the change? I hope people are realizing that no, we didn't. A quote coming from the ACLU says, quote, "It is virtually impossible to imagine how one closes Guantanamo Bay in light of this executive order." Said blah, blah, blah from the American Civil Liberties Union. In a little over 2 years, the Obama administration has done a complete about-face. Well, yeah, we called that they would do that. On the other side, though, Rep. Peter T. King, chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, said that the order vindicated Obama's predecessor, saying, quote, "I commend the Obama administration for issuing this executive order. The bottom line is that it affirms the Bush administration policy that the government has the right to obtain dangerous terrorists until the cessation of hostilities." Well, no, that doesn't confirm anything. It just says that there's another bad man who's willing to do what another bad man did. That's all. It doesn't confirm that we must do that as a nation in order to combat terrorism. It's just saying now two bad men agree that we should continue doing bad things. It's not any kind of a statement saying, well, it affirms that the policy of our government has the right. We have the right just because a few bad men say we have the right? I don't know. That's a little fishy to me.
Yeah, and one has to remember that this is not just something that can be used against foreign nationals or Muslims or scary people. It's really, I mean, with the powers that were given to the president, both under this, the Military Commissions Act, a whole bunch of legislation that came about post 9/11, really the president could detain you or me or anybody on his own say-so indefinitely without having to really present any evidence, meet any burden of proof to keep these people in indefinite detention. So you've given the president carte blanche, and not just this president, but future presidents, carte blanche to detain U.S. citizens indefinitely and not even meet a minimum standard of evidence to do that. Not even meet a minimum standard of evidence to suspend your right to be tried, beyond a reasonable doubt or even beyond the preponderance of the evidence. So you've got a situation where the whole trial by jury system can be short-circuited just like that. And thinking about giving that kind of president that kind of power, not just to, like the judiciary or the Congress to vote on a list of names of people to capture and detain indefinitely. When you're giving that much power to one man, an executive, the head of state, those are usually the people who round up political dissidents in other countries and lock them up indefinitely or kill them.
Yeah, not to mention,
executives are the executive branch is the worst possible branch of government to have this power. Not that any of them should have it.
Sure, not to mention these executive orders. I know we've talked about them a lot during the Bush administration because he used them all the time. But an executive order is just essentially bipartisan all the checks and balances that are supposed to be in the government, and the president just goes, "Oh, I think that I'm now going to do this." Sign a piece of paper saying I'm going to do this, and now I am doing it, and it's lawful.
Yeah, that's not the way it's supposed to work. I mean, it's supposed to be that the Congress makes law, the president executes law. That's why it's called the executive branch.
Yes, he signs the law. He doesn't write a law and then sign it.
Right. And he carries it out. I mean, the executive branch is the enforcement wing. They're the ones who actually collect the taxes.
That's why
command the military.
Congress declares war, and then the president
executes the war, carries it out.
And he's commander-in-chief once a war is declared, because now he is the one to execute it. And we haven't done that either, of course. We're so far from the Constitution, it's not even funny. So I don't want to bring all that up. But I do want to mention that these executive orders, I mean, all you liberals hated them when Bush was using them, and now Obama's using them in the exact same manner, signing the exact same executive orders that you all hated Bush for. So let's hopefully, you won't just think, well, he's a Democrat, so it's okay. Because it's not. It's still bad. Just because Democrats are doing it doesn't mean it's okay. It's still very, very bad. Okay? So I don't know. I don't think there's any point in the next election. What's it matter? Oh, no, vote Republican. No, that's not going to do anything either. I think the real solution to this problem is going to come later in the show with the movement in Texas. But first, I do want to mention, Nick, you did say that these detention centers holding people indefinitely without a trial or some kind of a tribunal trial where you don't even get to see the evidence against you before you're locked up forever or executed, they're not usually used against white people. They're usually used against brown people and Muslims. And, well, there's a whole lot of that going on right now, too. It's been all over the news recently about possible hearings about the Muslim community. What's going on here?
Yeah, Congressman King is going to be calling hearings to look into, I don't know, radicalism in the era. It's not even clear, just hearings about, he's going to have hearings about the Muslim American community, supposedly about radicalism, but it's curious to me because, granted, while most of the headline acts of terrorism, and certainly some of the biggest, September 11th in recent history, have been committed by terrorists who had a radical Islamic religious agenda, there are a lot of acts of terrorism that take place in the U.S. by, I don't know, radical Christians.
Actually, most of the acts of terrorists that take place on U.S. soil
environmentalists do
are not Muslims.
Right.
Most of them are crazy people.
Right.
Well, that's all acts of terrorism.
That's not necessarily even terrorism. That's just, they're scary, but they might not even know what they're doing.
But for the most part, it's like environmental zealots.
Right. You've got ELF, the Earth Liberation Front's
Yep.
been connected to a lot of, they burn SUVs and trash
people
houses
or crazy Christians blowing up abortion clinics and that kind of stuff. And then you
had the Timothy McVeigh, you had the bombing of the federal building.
But most of them
City.
aren't Muslims. Most of them. I mean, I think the FBI issued a report earlier. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was mind-blowing just how few acts of terrorism are committed in the U.S. by Muslims. Most of them are by white people.
I bet, yeah, but very few.
I guess Muslims you can practice Muslim and be white too, but most of them are what you'd consider the Christian faith.
Right, and yeah, and for some reason you don't see all these white Christian U.S. citizens being detained indefinitely in Guantanamo Bay because they're so dangerous, and they couldn't possibly be tried in the U.S. court system.
And there would be outrage if you were talking about having hearings on Christian Americans.
Oh yes, there would.
But since they're brown, it's okay. I've heard talk radio, at least the right-wing talk radio talking about all it is out there, about how these are so necessary and how why haven't these been called for 10 years ago? And the callers, they're all, yes, we need to hold hearings on these Muslims. And to me, it just screams, oh, wow, I think...
we know what comes next.
I think the Japanese understand that.
Yes, and the Japanese do understand it. Spurred by memories of the World War II era roundup, an internment of 110,000 of their own people. Remember, there were a lot fewer people in the U.S. then.
Is that how many it was? 110,000?
110,000 Japanese Americans. Remember, we also interred Germans and Italians during the Second World War. So, white people, too.
Mostly Japanese people, though.
Mostly Japanese, but some Italians and Germans. And this happened especially on the especially on the West Coast. So, this is where the outrage is now. There's a much larger Japanese-American community on the West Coast. They have been amongst the most vocal and passionate supporters of embattled Muslims. They've rallied public support against hate crimes at mosques, signed on to legal briefs opposing the indefinite detention of Muslims by the government, organized cross-cultural, and it is, as we just pointed out, largely indefinite detention of Muslims, not terrorists. Most of the white terrorists and non-Muslim terrorists get off. Organized cross-cultural trips to the Manzanar Internment Camp Memorial in California, and held bridging communities, workshops in Islamic schools and on college campuses. And last week, Representative Michael M. Honda, Democrat of California, who has a child spent several wartime years living behind barbed wire at Camp, I think it's Amache, in southeastern Colorado, denounced Representative King's hearings as something similarly sinister.
Yeah.
So that's coming from somebody who did actually, they're still alive today, they're in the U.S. Congress, at least Representative Honda, they were behind barbed wire. People still alive today were interned by their government for years. And actually, if you look into the history of those camps, some people would be offended that I'm drawing the comparison, but there were very high death rates. They weren't death camps, but there were very high death rates from disease.
Well, they'd shoot you if you tried to run away.
If you tried to run away, oh yes, you were being imprisoned.
Not to mention they took all your stuff.
But no, some of the camps, there were outbreaks of disease, and a lot of Japanese Americans died or suffered very ill treatment. These were somewhat cushier American concentration camps, but we don't talk about the fact that we put our citizens behind barbed wire.
Recent that was.
Yeah, and how little it's actually thought about.
So then you look at the federal government, and I know this is venturing into conspiracy land, Nick, but I think it's important just to think about the government is building these large detention centers that they're not really saying what it is, whether it's for FEMA in case there's a national disaster to house people, I don't know. But when they're building these big old internment camps, Nick, it does start to make you nervous when you look back in American history and, I don't know, 65 years ago, we rounded up 110,000 Japanese and threw them into a prison camp.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, that was the most egregious example. But if you look at policy that was put on the books, things that have been declassified now, plans that were put in place by the Pentagon, by the CIA, by the executive branch of government, they were very prepared to detain large numbers of Americans back then. They discussed doing terrible things to the American population if certain scenarios arose, because they love war games and planning. And the U.S. government has never, at least in the last 50 or 60 years, shied away from the idea of detaining or killing large numbers of U.S. citizens if they think there's some kind of a strategic interest in doing so.
Yes, the government
we usually only find out about it about 3 decades later when these memos and these cables are declassified.
Once the people who were doing it are out or dead or moved
so
on and can't be prosecuted.
Hopefully, if the worst doesn't happen, we'll hear about the awful plans that they were actually making for us at this time in 30 or 40 years. But we'll only hear about it and be like, that would have been awful if that actually had happened.
Or hopefully it will
actually
happen. You never know. I mean, this is the first start, though, Nick, of holding hearings about Muslims living in here in the America. I mean, it's the first step. I guess we've been calling them names already, so we've already started that step. You know, when you start, they say it with abusers, before say a man's about to abuse a woman, his wife or something, he'll start calling her names, dehumanizing her. So instead of calling her by her name, he'll start calling her B or whatever before he hits her. And it's the same thing when you're going to war against any people. You start making up horrible racial slurs about them. Just use your imagination. Think about any country or people, America, the United States.
There's a slur for every group of people we've been at war with.
You need to dehumanize them, and there's a whole bunch of them that we've been using against Muslims for about 10 years now. And next we're holding hearings in wake of the Gitmo is going to be there forever, watching them build these giant detainment centers. It's more than troubling.
Yeah, and the powers, unfortunately, as we've said before, the powers that the executive branch is accumulating, they grow. So not only will President Obama keep in place the doctrine of indefinite detention without a trial by jury, we'll also see this expanded, if not during this administration, then during the next one. And quite likely during this administration, we'll see additional powers. Maybe the president has the ability to... I think he already did. Didn't we already discuss back during the Bush era that the president could order executions without any kind of a...
It was one of those ones that didn't really pick up because he's not doing it now. That's the thing. You accumulate these powers. You don't use them right away.
Or at least not that we hear about it.
Or at least without... Well, I guess you wouldn't hear about it. But a lot of the time when you accumulate powers, you don't necessarily use them right away because then it's fresh in people's minds. You get them. People are, oh, I'm so mad. You hear if it's the liberals doing it, the conservative crowd will get mad. If the conservatives do it, the liberal crowd will get mad for a minute, and then nothing will happen, and they'll forget about them for a few years, and then they'll start being used. And it's disgusting, but it's what's happening out there. One of the reasons, Nick, I've given up on the federal government, I'm starting to see more and more of these movements. This one ran across my attention recently with a bunch of people in Texas talking about secession. I don't think it's ever going to happen, but I think as the federal government grows and starts becoming this abusive and people start waking up to it and going, wow, my federal tax dollars are going to execute Americans without a trial. They're going to hold people indefinitely without a trial, where my tax dollars are going to fund hearings to talk about Muslim community and about how we should start profiling them. it starts to make you feel icky and dirty and go, I don't want to pay into that system anymore because I don't want that on my conscience. I know I don't. It makes me feel horrible to think that I am working to propagate this system. I'm paying in to propagate the system, so the blood's on my hands as well, and it's disgusting.
Well, and if you look at most, the one good thing I will say here is even if you don't agree with the idea of secession, and you know most of you don't, it's a fringe viewpoint.
Yeah.
Not that I disagree with it, but it is a fringe viewpoint.
We've been conditioned, Nick, to think it's that way since the Civil War.
In the United States.
It's a racist thing to do.
Right. That's a paradigm in the United States.
Because we've been conditioned that way. That's not what it is, Nick, but that's how we've been conditioned.
Actually, what you're talking about is self-determination and those kinds of American ideals. You'll hear the founders talking about if you go back and read some of their writings. Sovereignty, self-determination, representative government, limited government, government that's small and accessible.
A true democracy where
a democracy or a republic. You can go back and forth, but you're a lot closer.
Smaller you get,
you're a lot closer to either of those if you get away from the system we have today.
Less centralized system.
I would point out for those of you who don't like talking about this issue and think someone's automatically a crazy person because they talk about it. That is largely, as you said, Toby, because you've been conditioned since elementary school to think about things that way here in the United States. Look at other developed nations with very similar legal and cultural traditions to the U.S., and you'll see that that's simply not the case. Canada, they actually have a developed debate about federalism, whether the provinces should seek sovereignty. The UK is the same way. And in Canada, it's not just Quebec, it's also Alberta. In the UK, there is a large Scottish national movement and a Welsh national movement, and it's considered a real possibility that at some time in, say, the next decade or two, Scotland might be its own completely independent nation. Not terribly likely to happen, but they exert a lot more sovereignty in some ways than even U.S. states. So this is what happens, Toby. When you have a debate about whether states or provinces or whatever you call them, whether constituent parts of a nation should go their own way and become independent because they don't like the way the federal government's going, it does serve to restrain the federal government. And that's about the only thing we have going for us in practical terms right now as a check on the federal government, is how much the state governments will put up with. Because we know Washington, D.C. has not followed the Constitution for decades. They barely even pay lip service to it anymore. So it's not like you can fight. Yeah, sometimes we'll win a good case. D.C. versus Heller, they affirmed the Second Amendment. Great. By and large, you can't rely on the courts to solve this problem. Congress is not going to bring government back down to a constitutional size. The president is certainly not going to do it. So where do you have to look?
The press just pays lip service now. The final check and balance. The people, they don't pay attention.
The people are the final check and balance.
And the press and talking about it, but they just publish whatever the White House puts out that day.
The people are the final check and balance.
We're asleep at the wheel.
Mostly asleep at the wheel. And those of you who are active, where else do you have to go? You're not going to leverage your city council to try to affect change on the federal level. If you feel like you don't have a voice in Washington anymore, and you really don't have much of one, then the next place you look is to your state capital. And that's what people are doing in Texas. The Texas National Movement will host a rally at the state capitol Saturday, urging lawmakers to put the matter of secession or Texas independence, as they're called. Independence is a much better word. Before the state's voters in a non-binding plebiscite resolution. The resolution, drawn up as a concurrent resolution of the legislature, spells out actions by the federal government which have intruded on the sovereignty of the state of Texas, and calls for the plebiscite to be included on the ballot of the next scheduled election for state constitutional amendments. That date is November 8th of this year. Now, it would only be an informational. This would not be a binding vote for secession, so it would only be informational. Results of that referendum would be sent not only to the state legislature in Texas, but also to the Congress and to the President of the United States. And I think that this kind of action, this is what it takes. And this isn't, we know this really isn't going to happen. Texas isn't going to vote for secession. Not today, but as things get worse, and they will because the federal government's bankrupting the country, it is time for the states to stand up to a point, and hopefully, at the very least, even if you don't agree with the idea of secession, at least having this kind of debate back in the mainstream it would at least get us to talk a little bit more about what the actual proper roles of the federal government would be, because it's all on one side right now.
What checks it should have, if
it has none. No effective checks.
I think, Nick, and we've seen more and more of this kind of debate happening. You've seen more states start to talk about it. And yes, it still is a very fringe movement, as you said, but I think as people start to see the federal government completely out of control, destroying the American way of life, infringing on people's rights, running the entire country into a third world nation, or at least the beginning steps, of course. It takes years to get there.
It'll take years, but
it takes years to
we're
get there.
on the road.
But the federal government's taking us down that course. I think it's going to become less fringe. I think more people are starting to buy on. And yeah, maybe in 10 years, this can be a real debate here. So that some states who do want to be free of this oppressive government, some people who don't want to fund this war machine, can say enough's enough. We can do just fine without the federal government. What do you do for us that we can't do on our own? The post office? Well, we can use FedEx or the UPS.
Well, we could probably lots of small countries have their own postal services.
No, but seriously, what can we do without, what does the federal government provide us that would affect my daily life? The post office. That's it, Nick.
Yeah, and that's nothing.
Oh, and of course those wars abroad, we need those.
Right. It's not just the other governments have post
Other than
offices.
that, they're just a hole in my pocket, sucking money away from me and spending on crap that makes me feel guilty.
And people will, that sentiment will become a lot more popular because there is going to be a lot more money sucked out of your pocket and you'll get a lot less in return.
Ask yourself, what has the federal government done for you today? Yeah. With all that money it took out of your paycheck, look at your paycheck, look at your stuff, look how much money they took, and then say, what have they done for me?
And it's not like the state governments are all that great.
Oh, no, but at least they're closer.
And
Nick.
yeah, you can keep...
And you would have choices. If you go, I don't want a huge government like the feds, I'm getting away from California, maybe I'll move to New Hampshire.
Right.
Or maybe you do want a huge federal government. I mean, people go to California, go to Massachusetts.
People might be put off by this because it seems like a radical argument, but arguing for the complete secession of states, to me, doesn't seem like any more of a radical departure, in many ways less radical of a departure, from the U.S. Constitution than saying the federal government can do whatever they want. I mean, the status quo today is equally as radical a departure from the U.S. Constitution as saying that Texas can go be their own country, do whatever they want, they're not part of the U.S. anymore. Well, Nick, because we have a federal government that just acts so far beyond the bounds of the Constitution.
It's a contract, Nick. Once someone breaks the contract, it's null and void. You're breaking it. And the federal government has definitely broken the contract, which is the Constitution, with the states. So that's my take. It's not going to happen, but I agree with it. We're out of time this week. We'd love to hear your opinions. You can log on to our website, freemindstv.com or freemindstv.org. We'll get media.org. I think it's freemindsmedia.org. We'll get you there. Or freemindstv.com or type us in
freemindsradio.com.
Find a way to get to our website and let us know your opinion. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have an excellent evening or day. You know, we always say tonight.
Those YouTubers, you're watching us during the day.
And some channels play us during the day as well. Or mornings. Have a good one.